Why did the sound of laughter cut deeper than bullets? Elena Marquez stood frozen in the church, her body wrapped in a gown that suddenly felt like paper armor. She could still hear his voice, the man who had promised her love, family, forever, breaking into a sneer before the microphone clattered to the floor. "I can't marry a nobody like you." His words echoed in the sanctuary, bouncing off marble, wood, and stained glass, until they were no longer just words, but blades slicing into her skin. Her bouquet trembled in her grip. White lilies, simple and bare, their petals falling like tears onto the polished floor. Around her 100 faces turned, some curious, some hungry, some cruel. The sound of laughter rose, low at first, then sharp, the kind that belonged in high school hallways, not a wedding aisle. Whispers rode the air like poison. "She doesn't belong here, she's nothing. She should have known better." She didn't cry, not here, not yet. Her parents had taught her something before the world took them away, that dignity was not given, it was chosen. She had carried that lesson into every room since, but today the weight of it pressed hard against her chest. Every nerve screamed to collapse, to run, to disappear. But her spine refused to bend. She stood in her plain white gown, no lace, no sparkle, because she had chosen honesty over spectacle. And now, that honesty felt like a scar under the scrutiny of eyes that judged her as unworthy. Her dark hair, pulled neatly back, framed a face without makeup, raw, vulnerable, unmasked. Not the kind of beauty that glittered in the pages of magazines, but the quiet kind forged in endurance. That, too, was mocked in their stares. Richard, the groom who had once claimed to love her simplicity, looked at her now with panic and disgust etched into his features. His family's pearl-draped matriarchs shifted in their seats, satisfied. His ex, Vanessa, smirked like a queen watching a rival executed. The church smelled of wax and lilies, but to Elena the air was heavy, choking, as if judgment itself had weight. Her gaze lifted once, not to Richard, not to the crowd, but to the stained glass above. Sunlight poured through, painting her in colors she did not feel, crimson, gold, indigo, as though God himself was trying to remind her of something she'd buried. Because she was not just a bride, not just a nobody. But that was a truth none of them knew yet. Her fingers tightened on the stems, thorns pricking her skin. She didn't flinch. She was trained not to flinch. The discipline of standing tall, of holding silence when silence was stronger than words, lived in her bones. She remembered nights alone with only the ticking of an old clock, mornings waking before dawn to the silence of an empty apartment, her name erased from records that once carried it with honor. The truth pressed at the edges of this humiliation. But truth, she knew, wasn't something you threw at a crowd to silence their laughter. Truth waited. Truth revealed itself like thunder after lightning. Right now, they only saw a woman abandoned at the altar, and she let them. The laughter was a knife, but knives sharpen resolve. Her mind slipped back to the night before, to the party that had been less celebration and more trial by fire. Chandeliers had glittered above her like mocking stars, every guest dressed in silk and power. She had stood in her plain gray dress, no jewelry, her hair down. Her silence had been their invitation to strike. "An orphan," they whispered, each syllable like a stain. "A miracle she's even here. A miracle he's even slumming for her." They had laughed then, too, and she had stood still, drinking water like it was wine, gripping the glass until it trembled. She had not fired back. Silence had been her shield. She had only said once, to a girl whose voice dripped with condescension, "A miracle's only needed when you doubt what's real." The words had frozen the girl's smirk, but the whispers had only grown louder. Richard's mother had reminded her in a whisper sharp as glass that marriage was an opportunity, not a guarantee. Vanessa had called her a climber, a parasite, a girl clawing her way upward from the dirt. A drunk man had leaned close, bourbon heavy on his breath, telling her she was out of her league. And Elena, she had looked him in the eye and said only, "My kind doesn't need to shout to be heard." They had hated her for that, for not breaking, for standing in their gold-laden room as though she belonged by sheer will alone. And yet she had still trusted Richard, trusted that beneath his family's cruelty, he loved her for her simplicity, her quiet strength, the very things he mocked now in front of the church. She had believed him, until this moment. But last night it held another shadow, one none of them knew about. She remembered the knock on her apartment door, the black SUV idling outside, the man in a dark coat whose face was half buried in shadow. He had not spoken long, only handed her an envelope, his voice low, urgent. "Tomorrow you'll need this truth." Inside had been a grainy photo, soldiers in uniform, and herself among them, younger, hard-eyed, wearing the insignia she thought she'd buried forever. Her breath had caught. Her past had come to her doorstep, a past she had locked away after the mission that broke her, a past she had vowed never to let define her again. And yet, as she held the photo, she'd felt the weight of the old dog tag on her nightstand, the one she had never thrown away. She had touched it once before leaving for the wedding, brushed her fingers across its worn metal, and she had told herself, this is not that life anymore. She had walked into the church believing she could still be just a bride. But Richard's words, the laughter, the humiliation, they were tearing open the locks on everything she had tried to bury. And then it came. A sound at first low, distant, like thunder rolling over hills. The guests hadn't noticed, too drunk on their mockery, but Elena noticed. Her ears, trained long ago to catch what others ignored, picked it out through the echo of laughter. Engines, many engines. The floor beneath the church trembled. Whispers died. Heads turned. The sunlight shifted with the shadow of helicopters slicing across the stained glass. Outside, the black SUVs lined the lawn, 100 of them, their engines a roar of authority. The doors burst open. Boots hit marble. Rows upon rows of figures in uniform filled the aisle with precision, their steps like thunder. And at their head, a man with weathered features and unshakable eyes. Commander Blake Rowe. His gaze locked on her, not on Richard, not on the sneering guests, not on the senator shifting nervously in her seat, on her. He walked forward, the 1,000 soldiers behind him saluting in perfect unison, the sound like a wave of steel. His voice carried, clear, steady, unbending. "Captain Marquez, it's time you reclaimed your honor." The bouquet slipped from her hands, petals scattered at her feet. The church was silent, the kind of silence that holds its breath. Elena's shoulders, hunched under humiliation a moment ago, straightened by a fraction. She did not move yet. She did not speak. But something in her eyes shifted, a reminder, faint but unbreakable, that she was not what they had called her, not the nobody they mocked. The storm had come for her, and the world was about to learn why. Why did their silence suddenly feel heavier than their laughter? The church had gone quiet, every whisper strangled by the sight of black uniforms filling the doorway. Dust from the SUVs drifted inside, shimmering in the filtered light of the stained glass. Guests sat stiff, their wine-flushed faces pale now, their cruelty curling back into their throats. Richard shifted at the altar, his collar tight, his hands clenching and unclenching as if he might vanish into the marble. Elena didn't move. The bouquet lay at her feet, petals scattered like remnants of a promise. Her face was calm, but inside her pulse thundered. Commander Rowe's words echoed. "Captain Marquez, it's time you reclaimed your honor." Honor, that word. It struck her harder than Richard's betrayal, harder than the laughter, because she knew what it meant, what it cost, and why it had been stripped from her. 1,000 boots stood behind Blake Rowe, salutes sharp as blades, eyes unyielding. They weren't here for Richard. They weren't here for the Hales' glittering name or their social empire. They were here for her. And suddenly, the woman who moments ago was the orphan bride mocked as nobody, was at the center of something no one in this church understood. Vanessa, her perfectly painted lips parted in disbelief, whispered to her neighbor, "This is insane. It's a stunt." But her voice lacked conviction. Richard's mother clutched her pearls so tightly they left marks on her skin. Senator Kane, The politician with silver hair and a tongue like a scalpel narrowed her eyes, already calculating. The silence dragged, thick as smoke. Elena's mind flashed backward, not to the laughter, not to Richard, but to that day 5 years ago, the day her honor was erased. The sound of gunfire, the stench of burning metal and dust, blood on her hands as she dragged a wounded soldier through mud, bullets snapping past her ears, her voice barking orders steady enough to keep the line from breaking, even though fear knotted her gut. That ambush, that night of hell. She remembered carrying men twice her size until her back screamed and her arms gave out. She remembered the fire in her lungs as smoke choked the air. And she remembered the promise. "You'll be honored for this, Captain. Your name will be written in the books." It had been a lie. When the reports were filed, her victory had been rewritten as failure. Her name had been buried, her rank stripped, and the order had come from somewhere high, untouchable. She had walked away in silence, carrying shame that wasn't hers, telling herself she would not fight for recognition. That dignity meant not clawing for what others refused to give. But now Commander Rowe was standing here, folder in hand, his eyes burning with the truth. He stepped forward, his voice cut like steel. "You've all judged a woman you know nothing about, but the world will know. 5 years ago, Elena Marquez led a covert SEAL unit into a firestorm. Over 100 soldiers walked out alive because of her. She carried them, shielded them, refused to leave anyone behind." Murmurs rippled through the pews, doubt tangled with shock. Rowe opened the folder, its pages stamped and sealed, official, irrefutable. Her mission was buried, her name erased to protect someone else's lies. That someone sits among you today. Heads turned toward Senator Kane. Kane didn't flinch, but her hand tightened on her purse until her knuckles whitened. Her jaw worked as though she could grind the accusation down with her teeth. Richard, desperate for control, spat out, "Hero, please. If she was such a hero, why's she hiding in a bargain dress, acting like a nobody?" His voice cracked, trembling, but he forced it louder. "This is just a show. She's nothing. She's always been nothing." The photographers leaned in, cameras snapping, vultures circling. Elena finally moved, just a step forward, just enough to silence him. Her voice was low, clear, unwavering. "Is that what you believe?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above his head. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came. His face faltered, drained of the false courage that had carried him this far. The room held its breath, waiting. And then a young SEAL, no older than Elena had been on her first deployment, stepped from the line. His hands trembled, but his eyes were fierce. He carried a small envelope and stopped in front of her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of memory, "you saved my brother in that ambush. He told me about you, said you carried him 2 miles under fire." The silence deepened. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their certainty bleeding away. Elena's lips parted, but she didn't speak. She took the envelope from the young man, her fingers brushing his. His salute snapped sharp and the others echoed him, 1,000 hands raised in respect. The sound of it reverberated through the church, louder than laughter, louder than cruelty. Elena's throat tightened. She had not asked for this. She had not begged for her name back. But standing there, the truth unfolded in front of all who had mocked her, and it was heavy. A woman in a blue shawl, her pearls trembling against her collarbone, stood up with indignation. "This is absurd. If she's such a hero, why does she live like a commoner? Why does she hide? It's too convenient." Elena's eyes met hers. "Hiding," she said softly, "or just living without needing your approval." The woman froze. The shawl slipped from her shoulders as she sat back down, her face red. Kane rose then, voice smooth but sharp. "This is nonsense. A failed soldier isn't a hero. This is theater." Some nodded, eager to cling to doubt. Others fidgeted, unsure. Elena didn't argue. She didn't shout. She didn't defend herself. She stood there, her silence heavier than their accusations, her presence cutting through their lies. Blake Rowe lifted the folder higher. The order to bury her record came from Senator Victoria Kane. Defense contracts, millions of dollars, power traded for one soldier's dignity. The crowd erupted in murmurs, shock rippling like waves. Kane's mask cracked, just for a breath, her eyes flashing with panic before steel replaced it. Richard, cornered and pale, tried once more, his voice shrill. "You're still an orphan, Elena. No name, no family. No one will ever truly love you." The words stung, more than she wanted them to, because they weren't just lies, they pressed against the old wound of being left alone in a world that never wanted her. Her hands trembled, but she lifted her chin. "You don't get to decide that." Her voice was soft, but in that softness was power. Richard crumpled, his face collapsing into his hands. For a moment, the church was utterly still. Then from outside, another SUV door slammed. Boots on gravel. A figure entered the doorway. A man in uniform, face hidden behind a mask. His steps deliberate, his presence cutting through the room like a storm front. He walked toward Elena, every eye locked on him. And when he stopped before her, he reached up, pulled the mask away. The scarred face beneath made Elena's breath hitch. Her knees almost gave. Daniel. The man they told her was dead. The man she had buried in her heart years ago. The man she had loved before the world took him. The metal in her hand slipped, caught by Rowe just in time. Daniel knelt, took her hand. His voice was low, steady, breaking the silence like dawn. "I never left you. I lived in the shadows to finish the mission. I never stopped fighting for you." The crowd gasped, some stood, others whispered in disbelief. Elena's tears came then, unstoppable. "Daniel," her voice cracked, but her grip on his hand was unshakable. The scar on his palm, jagged, unmistakable, was proof enough. She turned it upward for them to see. "Faking," she whispered, sharp, to the doubters. "Then why do I know this scar?" The room went still again, doubt silenced by truth. And for the first time in years, Elena Marquez allowed herself to believe she was not alone. How do you breathe when the dead come back to life in front of you? The church had been a chamber of humiliation only moments ago. Now it was a place holding its breath. Elena's hand trembled in Daniel, the warmth of his skin at odds with the memory she carried of graves, folded flags, and silence that had never been broken. They told her he was gone. They told her to let go. She had buried him in her soul, wept in silence, and learned to live without the man who once promised forever. But here he was, scarred, older, weary, but alive. "I never left you," he said again, his voice steady though his eyes burned with things only war could carve into a man. "They told you I was dead to protect you, to protect the mission. I had to disappear, but I never stopped, not from the fight, not from you." The crowd erupted in chaos. Gasps, whispers, disbelief spilling over like a storm breaking through weak walls. Some cried out it was impossible. Others leaned forward as though they had just witnessed a ghost. Cameras flashed. Hungry for the headline, the groom walked away, but the dead returned. Elena's lips parted, but words failed. Her heart was a battlefield, grief colliding with relief, love wrestling with disbelief. Her fingers brushed the scar on his palm again, proof tangible under her touch. The scar she had stitched herself one night in a desert hospital, her hands slick with his blood, her voice steady while her soul trembled. It was him, it could only be him. Richard staggered backward, his face pale as wax. This is staged," he shouted, his voice shrill, desperate. "You're all being played, he's dead, he's supposed to be dead." Daniel's gaze cut to him, calm but sharp. "You wanted her broken, you never deserved her, and now the whole world knows it." Richard's lips moved, but no words came. He sank into a pew, small and pathetic under the weight of truth. Senator Kane rose again, trying to seize back control. Her voice was sharp, slicing through the murmurs. "Enough of this theater. Soldiers resurrected, conspiracies spun, all to hide the fact that this woman is nothing. You can dress her in medals, but it doesn't erase her failure. The word failure echoed, the word they had pinned to Elena like a brand. Elena's hand slipped from Daniel's. She stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Her heels clicked on marble, her gown whispering against the floor. She faced Cain, her eyes steady. You buried my name to build your empire. You signed my silence so you could profit from blood. Cain's lips curled, but no words came. The accusation landed heavy, undeniable. The guests shifted uneasily. Some had scoffed before, but now their eyes darted between Elena, Daniel, and the soldiers lined like steel. Doubt cracked into fear. Blake Rowe's voice boomed. We have the documents, the orders, the defense contracts signed in Cain's hand. Elena Marquez was erased so Cain could stand on her ashes. That ends today. The folder slammed shut, its sound like a gavel. Cain's mask slipped. Her hand trembled on the pew. For the first time, power looked fragile on her face. A woman in the front row whispered, trembling, "If this is true, then everything we said about her, everything we laughed at." Her husband leaned close, voice low but cutting. "We were wrong, dead wrong." Elena didn't bask in their regret. She didn't need their apologies. She only looked forward, her chin lifted, her silence louder than their noise. And yet the whispers didn't stop. She's still just an orphan. She's using this for sympathy. No family, no real place. Each word was a reminder of the old wound. That ache of being unwanted, unseen, left behind. Her hand brushed the metal Rowe had handed her, the metal cold but steady in her grip. She lifted it, not high, just enough for the light to strike it. "I don't need your approval," she said softly. "I already have a family, the kind that never leaves you behind." The 1,000 seals saluted in unison, the sound reverberating like thunder rolling through the church. The walls themselves seemed to tremble. For a moment, Elena wasn't a bride humiliated at the altar. She was Captain Marquez again, the name they tried to bury spoken not with pity but with respect. And still Cain hissed, desperate, "This is all for show. Even if she was a soldier once, look at her now. Look at this farce. She's still nobody." Nobody, the word hung heavy. Elena turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping every face that had sneered, laughed, whispered. Her voice was low, calm, unwavering. "Nobody," she paused, letting the silence sharpen her words. "Then why are they all here for me?" She gestured to the seals, their salutes unbroken, their loyalty unwavering. The crowd faltered. Some lowered their eyes, some flushed with shame. Some still clung to doubt, but the doubt was weaker now, cracked under the weight of truth. Daniel stood behind her, his presence steady, unshakable, but he let her carry this moment alone. It was her fight, her name, her reclamation. Cain's shoulders slumped. For the first time, the senator looked small. But not everyone in the church was ready to yield. A reporter stood from the back, his suit cheap, his pen trembling in his hand. His voice was loud, brash, desperate for attention. "I've got sources. They say you were discharged for cowardice, Captain. Care to comment?" The title dripped with mockery. Elena's eyes flicked to him, her hand steady, though her heart pounded. "Sources?" she asked, her voice even cutting, "or stories you paid for?" The room shifted, gasps. A phone slipped from someone's hand, shattering against the marble. The reporter froze, his face flushing red. He sat back down, silenced by her words. Elena's silence reclaimed its power. Blake Rowe stepped forward, holding out the folder again. His eyes steady, his voice clear. "You deserve to tell this part yourself." She took it. Her hand was steady now, her voice calm though her chest rose and fell with weight she had carried for years. "The mission was real. The lives I saved were real, but my name was buried to protect lies, lies signed by Cain." Her eyes locked on the senator, who sat frozen, color drained from her face. "You gave the order, didn't you?" The church gasped. Every eye turned to Cain. Cain's lips moved, No words came. Her silence was her confession. The weight of memory surged through Elena. The battlefield, the fire, the screaming, the weight of bodies she had carried, the promise that her name would be honored, the betrayal when her record was erased. It all collided into this moment. Her voice steady, almost quiet, cut sharper than a shout. So my erased name was to protect a traitor. Kane's purse slipped from her lap. Her hands shook. Elena closed the folder, set it gently on the altar. The action was deliberate, final. And when she stepped back, the church was not the same. She was not the same. The woman mocked as a nobody, humiliated as an orphan, stood now as Captain Marquez. Not because they gave her the name back, but because she had never let it die. The silence was no longer heavy with judgment. It was heavy with respect, with awe, with fear. And Elena, for the first time in years, allowed herself to breathe. What happens when the room that mocked you suddenly fears you? The air in the church was thick, no longer with laughter, but with the weight of truth pressing down on everyone's chest. Elena stood at the altar, gown whispering around her, a folder of lies and betrayal now resting where vows were supposed to be spoken. The sacred space that had been turned into a spectacle of humiliation now pulsed with a new, unsteady reverence. She had not asked for this storm, but storms do not ask permission. They arrive and they change everything. Kane sat stiff in her pew, her silver hair gleaming under the fractured light. Her fingers shook as she tried to gather the remains of her composure, but every eye was on her. The cameras flashed like lightning, freezing her mask of defiance as cracks spread across it. She had survived scandals before, navigated whispers and rumors, but this was different. This was truth, raw and heavy, wrapped in military precision and carried by men and women whose loyalty was unquestionable. Lies, Kane hissed under her breath, but it wasn't conviction anymore. It was desperation. Richard slumped 2 rows away, his head buried in his hands. His suit, pressed and perfect only an hour ago, now hung on him like a costume torn apart. He had played the part of groom, of proud son, of the man who believed he was doing the rejecting. But now rejection clung to him instead, suffocating, inescapable. The eyes of the crowd no longer mocked Elena, they mocked him. The guests shifted, their expensive perfumes clashing with the acrid stench of fear. Some still clung to disbelief, but most were watching Elena now with something uncomfortably close to awe. The girl they had dismissed was no longer invisible. And she hadn't spoken in anger, she hadn't begged, she hadn't shouted. Her silence had been enough. Blake Rowe turned his gaze across the room, his voice a blade cutting through the uncertainty. You saw her humiliated. You called her nothing. But here stands Captain Elena Marquez, soldier, survivor, leader. While you whispered, she carried men bleeding out of battle. While you laughed, she bore the cost of your lies. Every syllable landed like a hammer. Some guests flinched, others lowered their heads. Then came the sound of boots again. 2 agents moved down the aisle, their presence cold, deliberate. They stopped at Kane's pew. For a moment she didn't move, her spine rigid, her jaw clenched. But when one spoke, "Senator, you're not leaving," her body sagged. The pearls at her neck rattled as though they too trembled with her. The crowd gasped. Gasps that had been for Elena's humiliation were now for Kane's collapse. Phones rose like weapons, recording every step, every flicker of Kane's panic. Her voice, once commanding enough to steer nations, shrank into a hiss. This isn't over. But it was, and everyone knew it. Elena didn't watch Kane being cornered. She didn't need to. Her eyes weren't for Kane anymore. They lifted once to the stained glass where fractured beams of light painted her face in shades of crimson and gold. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who believed she could bury her past, wear a plain gown, and carve a new name in silence. That girl had been broken at this altar, but another stood in her place now. Her hand brushed against the metal again, heavy, cold, a reminder that honor was not a gift, it was earned in blood and bone. She had carried that weight in silence for years, and now the world had seen it. But still, doubts lingered in the room. A woman in a silk scarf rose, her voice trembling but sharp. Metal or not, she's still the girl nobody wanted at the altar. Her words slashed through the silence, cutting at Elena's heart with the precision of someone who understood cruelty too well. A murmur followed, agreement from those who could not let go of their prejudice, from those who clung to their disdain as though it shielded them from shame. Elena turned, her eyes finding the woman. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. Nobody, she let the word hang, let it sink. Then she lifted her chin. Then why are they all here for me? Her arm gestured toward the 1,000 seals, their salutes unwavering, their loyalty undeniable. The scarf slipped from the woman's shoulders as she sank back into her seat. Her face burned red. The murmurs died. And for the first time, the silence was not cruel, it was reverent. Daniel stood a step behind her, his presence steady, his scars like proof carved into flesh. He had been the ghost she thought gone forever, and now he was here, living, breathing, carrying his own truths she had yet to hear. But for now he said nothing. He let her stand. He let her claim what was always hers. Vanessa, Richard's ex, shifted uncomfortably, her earlier smirk gone. The power she wielded in whispers seemed ridiculous now, her voice drowned under Elena's presence. She reached for her purse but fumbled, her hands trembling. Richard's mother, Margaret, tried to rise. Her voice cracked with fury, pearls trembling at her throat. "This is outrageous. My son doesn't deserve to be dragged into this spectacle." Her words fell flat. No one echoed her. No one supported her. Her family name, once a shield, now seemed brittle under the weight of truth. She sat back down, lips tight, face pale. Richard looked up once, his eyes hollow, his face flushed with shame. He tried to speak, but nothing came. He looked at Elena, the woman he had mocked, abandoned, and for the first time he seemed to realize what he had lost. Not status, not a trophy bride, but a force he could never measure up to. A guest in the back, a man in a slick suit desperate to reclaim control of the narrative, rose to his feet. His voice was smug, loud enough to carry. "This is all a show, a scam to manipulate us, to make her into something she's not." Elena turned her gaze on him. No anger, no fury, just truth. "A scam?" she asked, her voice low, deliberate. "Tell that to the men I carried out of the fire. Tell that to the ones who lived because I refused to leave them." The man faltered, his grin cracking. His voice died in his throat. The murmurs around him shifted again, this time not with doubt but with something heavier, with belief. Blake Rowe raised his hand, and the seals behind him moved as one, their boots echoing like thunder. Another agent stepped forward, carrying a velvet box. Inside gleamed a medal, the one that should have been Elena's years ago. Blake took it, his voice clear. "This was yours, they hid it, no more." He handed it to her. Her hands trembled as she took it. She lifted it high enough for the light to catch. The church filled with the sound of applause, not polite, not shallow, but raw. Soldiers roared their approval, their voices shaking the walls. Elena's voice rose, steady, clear. "I don't need false love. I already have a family, the kind who never abandons me." The words hit harder than any accusation could. The applause swelled, shaking the very floor. Guests who had mocked her sat frozen, unable to meet her eyes. Some wept quietly, shamed by their cruelty. Others clapped, hesitant at first, then louder, swept up by the truth pressing down on them. Richard sat crumpled, his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, whether from shame or rage, no one knew. Kane tried to stand again, her voice sharp, but two agents blocked her, stone-faced, unyielding. Her power had evaporated. And Elena stood tall, the metal gleaming at her chest, the weight of silence no longer crushing but carrying her. The girl mocked as nobody was gone. In her place stood a woman who had never needed their approval, only her own. The storm had broken, but the reckoning was not over. Because outside those church doors the world waited. Cameras, headlines, a society ready to either crown her as hero or tear her apart again. And Elena Marquez, for the first time in years, was ready to face it. How does the truth move once it escapes four walls? The church doors remained open, letting in the roar of engines, the thrum of helicopters, the sharp light of a sun that felt hotter now, harsher, as though even the sky had decided to bear witness. Outside, cameras clustered like wolves, lenses pointed, microphones outstretched, hungry for blood, for spectacle, for the story that would travel faster than breath. Inside, the silence was different now. It was no longer filled with mockery. It was thick with awe, disbelief, and something else, fear. Not of Elena herself, but of the truth she carried, the storm she embodied. She stood with the medal at her chest, the velvet box still warm in her hand. 1,000 salutes held the air like scaffolding around her. Richard was collapsed into his seat. Kane's face was carved into panic. Margaret Hale's pearls rattled faintly as she fidgeted, and Vanessa's smirk was gone, wiped away by the sound of boots and applause. And yet Elena didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Her heart was heavy. Heavier even than when Richard spat the words, "I can't marry a nobody like you," because victory wasn't sweet when it was born from betrayal and silence breaking all at once. She had wanted a quiet life. She had wanted peace, but peace had never wanted her. The crowd stirred as Rowe raised his hand. The seals snapped out of salute, moving with precision, lining the aisle like a corridor of steel. Their presence was no longer just protection. It was proclamation. "Captain Marquez," Rowe said, his voice carrying firm but not forceful, "the world outside is waiting. Your silence ends here." Elena's breath caught. She glanced at the doors, the swarm of press, the flashing bulbs, the restless shadows of the crowd outside. She had been erased once by official reports, by signatures buried in red tape. Now the opposite loomed. Her name shouted into every headline, her face plastered across every screen. She didn't want it. She wanted only dignity. But dignity doesn't always get to choose the stage it's called onto. Daniel stepped forward then, his presence steady, scarred, unyielding. His voice was low, meant only for her. "You don't have to speak if you don't want to. Not to them, not to anyone. You owe them nothing." His hand hovered near hers, not clutching, not demanding, but there if she wanted to take it. Her heart ached. His face, the one she had mourned, stood inches from hers. The scar she once stitched, now proof of a story that had never ended. But the years between them pressed down, years of silence, years where she believed he was gone. She loved him still, but love born again carried its own pain. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "You already are," Daniel replied. The words struck her harder than the medal's weight. She had been speaking all along, not in the way the crowd wanted, not in explanations or excuses, but in the quiet strength of refusal to bend. Her silence was her voice. But now the choice loomed. To walk out, to face the world, to let them see her not as Richard's discarded bride but as Captain Elena Marquez. The guests shifted again. Some eyes were still cruel, unwilling to yield. A woman in red leaned toward her companion. "It's all propaganda. Watch, she'll play the victim card." Elena heard it, every whisper still cut, but instead of sinking into her, it slid off her like rain against stone. She turned to the seals. Their eyes locked on her, unflinching, and for the first time since her name had been buried, she didn't feel alone. Blake Rowe gestured toward the doors. "When you're ready." She nodded, though her hands trembled. The bouquet still lay shattered on the floor. She didn't pick it up. Some symbols didn't need reclaiming. Her gown rustled softly as she moved forward, Daniel at her side, Rowe just behind. The seals shifted, forming a corridor leading to the sunlight. Every step echoed on marble, heavy with the weight of years of silence and shame. And then she was outside. The world exploded. Shouts, flashes, questions hurled like stones. "Is it true you were erased? Captain, were you dishonorably discharged? Are you exploiting this moment for sympathy? Who is the man at your side? The press surged, corralled only by the presence of black SUVs and soldiers who stood like walls of iron. Helicopters circled overhead, their shadows slashing the ground. Elena flinched at the first burst of camera flashes, not because she feared them but because they reminded her of muzzle fire in the dark. The staccato bursts of combat burned into her memory. She blinked once, steadying her breath. She had stood under worse fire. Her voice was low, almost drowned by the chaos, but when she spoke it carried. The truth doesn't need your permission. The frenzy didn't stop, but the words cut through it, recorded, amplified, carried. A soldier's cadence in a civilian storm. Kane was escorted out behind her, hands trembling, agents gripping her elbows. The crowd's attention shifted, snapping pictures of her downfall, shouting accusations. Her face was pale, her lips tight, her legacy crumbling in real time. Kane had entered the church as a power. She left it as prey. Richard stumbled outside a few moments later. Alone. Forgotten. Cameras turned, but not with awe, with ridicule. He shielded his face, muttering denials, excuses, but no one listened. Even his own family turned from him, their ambitions shredded by the truth tied to Elena's name. Margaret Hale's pearls snapped as she yanked at them, the string scattering white beads onto the steps. She bent to gather them, but it was futile. The image burned into cameras, a perfect symbol of a family's fall from grace. Inside, the guests had begun to scatter, their laughter gone, replaced with silence or excuses whispered into phones. Some would slip away quietly, their shame too heavy. Others would try to rewrite themselves as allies in hindsight. But Elena didn't watch them. She had no more use for their eyes. She stood on the steps, Daniel at her side, row behind, seals surrounding her like a wall of truth. The metal gleamed on her chest, a weight she carried with quiet steadiness. The questions kept flying. Will you testify against Kane? What about the missing years? What about the man you were supposed to marry? She didn't answer them all. She didn't need to. Her silence was still her strongest answer. But one question pierced her. Do you think anyone will ever truly love you? It came from somewhere in the swarm, a voice cruel, mocking. Her throat tightened. The wound Richard had torn open still bled in her chest. But before she could form a reply, Daniel stepped closer, his voice clear, steady. I already do. The crowd roared, some with disbelief, some with awe, some with derision. But it didn't matter. His words weren't for them. They were for her. Her eyes closed just for a breath, as tears threatened. She had stood through humiliation, through lies, through silence. And here, in the blinding chaos of the world outside, she allowed herself to feel the weight of being seen. Not as nobody, not as orphan, not as failure, but as Elena. And for the first time in years, the name felt whole again. The press kept shouting. Headlines were already forming, carried on invisible wires into every corner of the country. Hero bride, buried soldier, political scandal. The world was already turning, already feeding. But Elena didn't flinch. She stood steady, the metal heavy, Daniel's presence steady, Rose's protection sure. She didn't know what would come tomorrow. She didn't know how long the world's applause would last or how quickly they would turn. But she knew one truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And today, dignity had walked her down the aisle, not to Richard, not to vows broken in laughter, but to the truth of who she had always been. How do you walk forward when the ground you stand on is still shaking? Elena had left the church steps, but the echo of them remained. The flash of cameras, the roar of questions, the sting of Richard's last insult twisting in the air. She hadn't answered most of it. She hadn't needed to. Her silence and the metal on her chest had done the speaking for her. But the silence afterward, the silence of a city inhaling her story, a nation whispering her name, was louder than anything she had known. The SUVs carried her away from the chaos, their engines humming steady like a heartbeat. Soldiers sat across from her, silent, respectful, their eyes forward. Daniel was beside her, close enough to feel but not yet close enough to bridge the years that had been carved between them. Blake Rowe sat across, his gaze sharp, measuring her not as a spectacle but as a soldier who had once been his equal. The city outside blurred. Billboards, skyscrapers, crowded streets, all of it drowned beneath the storm that had erupted. Elena sat with her hands folded in her lap, the metal pressing against her gown like a brand. She had never asked for this return. She had never wanted her name shouted, yet here it was, unavoidable. Blake broke the silence first. "You did well in there." Her head lifted slowly, eyes narrowing. "I didn't do anything. You and your men, you did everything." He shook his head. "No, we only brought the truth. You carried it, you always have." Her chest tightened. Words hovered on her lips, unspoken. She wanted to tell him she didn't feel like a carrier of truth, that she had lived as though she were a ghost, a shadow of the name she once bore. But soldiers know better than to confess weakness when it feels like an open wound. She only nodded, her silence carrying what she couldn't say. Daniel's voice broke the quiet then. "They're not done with you, you know that, right?" She turned to him, her throat tight. His face was older, marked with scars that hadn't been there before. His eyes were the same though, steady, dark, full of the weight of unspoken things. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "You didn't ask," he said softly, "but you lived through it. That's enough to make them hungry." She swallowed hard. The SUV turned, sirens in the distance cutting through the hum of the city. Somewhere out there, Kane was being booked, cameras following her like vultures on carrion. Richard's face was plastered across social feeds, already a meme, his name trending for all the wrong reasons. The Hale family's fortune of reputation was collapsing like a house of cards in the wind. And Elena was suddenly everywhere. War hero bride. Orphan soldier returns in disgraceful wedding collapse. Scandal or sacrifice, the truth behind Captain Marquez. The headlines were already twisting. Some painted her in glory, some in suspicion. The world never told one story when two could bleed against each other. She felt the weight of it pressing down. She hadn't spoken her truth for years, and now it was torn from her and broadcast on every corner. Her voice cracked when she spoke again. "What if I don't want it?" Daniel looked at her, his jaw tightening. "Elena, you've never had the luxury of choosing what the world does with you, but you can still choose what you stand for." She turned her face away, staring at the passing blur of the city through tinted glass. His words hurt, not because they were cruel but because they were true. Blake leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "The Pentagon will want you back. Not in uniform maybe, but in some capacity. They'll want your face. They'll want your story. And Kane's enemies. They'll want you too. You're about to be dragged into a war of a different kind." Her chest ached. She had traded one battlefield for another, and neither had asked her if she wanted to fight. The SUV slowed, pulling into a nondescript building tucked into the city's heart. Soldiers moved quickly, securing the perimeter, their boots echoing sharp. Elena stepped out, her gown now wrinkled, dirt clinging to the hem from the church steps. She felt like a soldier disguised as a bride, or perhaps a bride unmasked as a soldier. She wasn't sure which anymore. Inside, the air was cold, metallic. Screens lit the walls with news coverage. Her face on one, Kane's mugshot on another, Richard's collapse replayed for millions. A reporter's voice echoed through the speakers. "Captain Elena Marquez, the woman they called a nobody, may just bring down one of the most powerful senators in Washington. But is she hero or hoax?" The words stung more than she wanted to admit. Daniel's hand brushed hers, tentative. "Don't listen to them." She pulled slightly away, not in rejection but in hesitation. 7 years, she whispered. 7 years they told me you were dead. 7 years I lived alone with that silence. And now you stand here like none of it happened. I don't even know who you are anymore." His face tightened. "I never had a choice. I was undercover. I was fighting. I thought if you believed I was gone, you'd be safer." Her voice rose, sharp with pain. "Safe? You think burying me alive in grief made me safe?" The room went silent, soldiers glancing away, pretending they hadn't heard. Blake looked down, jaw clenched, giving them the privacy of not interfering. Daniel's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "I thought I was protecting you. I was wrong." Her breath came uneven, the metal heavy on her chest. She wanted to reach for him, to collapse into the arms she had once known. But love isn't seamless when broken and stitched together again. Scars don't fade just because the body survives. "I don't know if I can forgive that," she whispered. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "Not today." Her eyes met his, and though her heart was raw, there was something in his gaze that steadied her. Not the certainty of answers, but the promise of standing, even in the uncertainty. Blake finally spoke, breaking the fragile silence. "Captain, you need to decide. Do you want to face the press tomorrow, or do we take you somewhere they can't reach?" The choice was a weight all its own. To hide again, to vanish into silence, letting the storm rage without her, or to step forward to stand in the fire, knowing it would consume her if she wasn't careful. Her fingers brushed the metal, cold, heavy, real. "I've been erased once," she said softly. "I won't let them erase me again." Blake nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement. Daniel's hand lingered at her side, close but not holding, waiting. And Elena, for the first time since the church, let herself inhale fully. The storm outside was only growing, but she had stood in worse storms. She would stand again. How do you face a world that has already decided what you are? The morning came faster than Elena expected. She hadn't slept, not truly. The hours bled into each other, restless, thick with the echo of questions shouted outside the church. Her hotel room had been guarded, secured by seals, but safety wasn't the same as peace. She lay awake in her gown until dawn, staring at the ceiling, the metal heavy on the nightstand beside her, its ribbon coiled like a reminder of chains both broken and unbroken. By sunrise, the world had already taken her name and spun it into threads of glory and scandal. Screens across the city blared headlines: "Hero Bride Betrayed Altar," "Secret Past of Captain Marquez," "Who is She?" Some painted her as savior, others as fraud, a saint, a soldier, a pawn, a liar. It didn't matter what the truth was. The truth never mattered as much as the story people chose to believe. She sat at the edge of the bed, her plain white dress wrinkled, her hair loose, her face bare. Not glamorous, not polished, just herself, and already that was enough to divide a nation. Daniel knocked once before stepping inside. His uniform was simple, worn, the scars on his face catching the pale light of morning. He didn't smile. He didn't pretend the night hadn't carved more distance between them. "They're waiting," he said quietly. She looked at him, her throat tight. "And if I'm not ready?" "Then they'll eat you alive," he answered, blunt but not cruel. "The world doesn't wait for the truth, Elena. It devours what it wants." Her chest ached. She had survived battlefields, carried bleeding men on her shoulders. Yet here she was, terrified of microphones and cameras, terrified not of bullets but of words. Daniel stepped closer, his voice softer. "But you've never let them break you, not when they buried your name, not when Richard humiliated you, not when Cain tried to drown you in lies. You don't have to give them all of you, just enough to remind them you're still standing." She nodded once, though her hands trembled. Blake Rowe arrived moments later, crisp in his uniform, every inch the commander. "It's time," he said simply. His eyes met hers, not cold, not unfeeling, just steady, reminding her she wasn't walking into this alone. The press conference was set in a government building downtown. Security was heavy, cameras positioned in rows like an army of glass eyes. The hum of voices filled the room, journalists whispering, adjusting their recorders, preparing their knives. When Elena stepped onto the stage, the room erupted. Shouts, flashes, The air itself vibrated with hunger. She stood at the podium, the metal at her chest, her hands gripping the edge. For a moment, the noise threatened to consume her. And then she spoke. Her voice was low, almost fragile. But the room quieted because fragility, when it refuses to break, commands more attention than shouting ever could. "I was told once," she began, "that dignity doesn't need to beg, it only needs to stand." The words hung there, soft, deliberate. The room shifted. She continued, her voice steadier. "5 years ago, I led men and women into a mission we weren't supposed to survive. We did because of them, not because of me alone, but when we returned, the reports said we failed. My name was erased. My record was buried, and I thought silence was strength. I thought if I let them take it from me, I would still be whole." Her throat caught, she paused. The cameras leaned closer. "But silence turned me into a ghost. And yesterday, at an altar, they called me a nobody." The memory stabbed her, but she didn't flinch. "Maybe you've been called that too," she said softly. "Maybe you've been told you don't belong, that your past makes you less, that your name doesn't matter. I know that pain. I've carried it." The room was silent now. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. "And I want you to know," she whispered, her eyes sweeping across the rows, "you are not what they say you are, and neither am I." For a moment the silence was pure, heavy, unbroken. Then the questions came. "Do you accuse Senator Kane directly of treason? Was your medal intentionally hidden? Are you going to testify before Congress? Is Daniel Hale really alive, or is this some elaborate scheme?" The words hit like bullets, sharp, relentless. Elena stood still, her breathing even. "I will tell the truth," she said finally. "The rest is noise." Kane's downfall was already unraveling on screens across the world. Clips of her shouting in the church, images of her being escorted by agents, leaked documents tying her to defense contracts signed in the blood of soldiers. Commentators tore at her legacy, once ironclad, now rusted through. By nightfall, her career would be over. Richard's disgrace deepened by the hour. Memes of him walking away from the altar spread faster than fire. His family cut him loose in public statements. Margaret Hale's pearls, broken on the church steps, became a symbol, late-night hosts holding them up as punchlines. For the Hales, the dynasty was done. But for Elena, it wasn't that simple. Behind the stage, after the lights dimmed and the cameras turned elsewhere, she sat in a small room, her head in her hands. The applause, the praise, the vitriol, none of it felt like victory. It felt like being pulled apart. Daniel sat across from her, silent. He had stood in the shadows during her speech, watching, waiting. Now he leaned forward, his voice low. "You were brilliant," he said. She shook her head. "I was just surviving." "That's what brilliance looks like," he replied. Her throat tightened. She wanted to reach for him, to believe his words, but 7 years of absence pressed between them. "Do you know what it did to me?" she whispered. "Every night I waited. Every night I thought you were gone, that your body was somewhere unburied, that you had left me with nothing but silence. And I tried to build a life out of that silence. I tried to believe I could start over. And then yesterday, you appeared. And I don't know if I can carry that." His jaw clenched, his eyes softened. "I never stopped carrying you." Her breath broke, but tears didn't come. She had shed too many in the years past. "Then why does it still hurt?" she asked. "Because survival costs," Daniel said quietly, "and we're both paying for it." She looked at him then, really looked. At the scars, the wear, the distance in his eyes. He had lived battles she hadn't seen. He had carried ghosts she hadn't known. They were the same and not the same all at once. And maybe that was the truest thing about love, that it wasn't about finding someone unchanged. It was about standing with someone despite the change. But she wasn't ready to say that, not yet. Blake Rowe entered then, breaking the moment. "Captain Marquez, Congress will call you in the next days. Kane's trial is coming. You'll be their witness, their symbol." Elena's spine stiffened. She had wanted silence. Now they demanded her voice. She nodded once. "I'll speak, but on my terms." Blake's eyes narrowed, then softened. "That's the only way you've ever spoken." The room fell quiet after he left. Daniel reached for her hand again, this time not asking, not demanding, just placing his scarred fingers near hers, close enough for her to choose. For a moment she let her hand hover, not pulling away, not closing the gap, just resting in the space between. Because sometimes survival means not rushing into answers. Sometimes survival means standing in the uncertainty and breathing anyway. And for the first time since the church, Elena realized she was breathing steady. How do you end a story that was never supposed to begin? The courthouse was different from the church, but the air felt the same, heavy, watching, waiting. The marble floors gleamed, the ceilings stretched high, the flags hung like judgment. Rows of press filled the benches, their cameras humming softly. They weren't here for the law, they were here for spectacle. And Elena Marquez, once mocked as nobody, once humiliated as a bride, now walked the aisle not in a gown but in a dark suit, metal at her chest, her hair pulled back, her silence steady. Senator Victoria Kane sat across from her at the defense table, her once iron posture bent beneath the weight of disgrace. The silver in her hair no longer gleamed. The pearls she had worn were gone. Her lawyers whispered urgently, their faces pale, but she barely listened. Her eyes flicked once toward Elena, not with power, not with venom, but with something smaller: fear. The judge's gavel cracked. "Proceed." Kane's charges were read aloud. Corruption, fraud, conspiracy. Words Elena had known in her bones years before, words she had lived under while Kane built her empire. Now the world spoke them loud enough for Kane to hear. Elena was called to the stand. She rose, her footsteps quiet, deliberate. Every lens turned, every pen poised. She sat, placed her hand on the oath, and when she lifted her chin, the room felt smaller under her gaze. The prosecutor's voice was calm. "Captain Marquez, please describe, in your own words, the mission 5 years ago." Her breath caught. Memories flooded: gunfire, blood, smoke. The weight of a soldier's body over her shoulder. The sound of screams cutting through the night. She closed her eyes once, then opened them steady. "I led 12 men into an ambush. We were told the area was clear. It was. We were surrounded. I carried them out. Everyone I could. 2 miles under fire. I lost some. I saved more. I don't remember the weight. I only remember refusing to stop." The courtroom was silent. Even the pens stilled. "And when you returned," the prosecutor pressed. "My report was changed. I was called insubordinate. I was told my mission was a failure. My name was erased. My medal withheld. And the one who gave that order," she turned, her eyes locking on Kane, "was her." Kane flinched, just slightly, but the tremor spread across the room like ripples on water. The defense scrambled, throwing objections, but the document spoke louder. Pages stamped with red seals. Contracts tied to Kane's accounts. Orders signed in her hand. Elena's voice stayed calm. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. She made millions while soldiers buried their own. She hid behind my silence, but silence is not weakness. It was survival. And today I choose not to survive it anymore. I choose to speak. Her words landed heavy. The crowd shifted. The judge leaned forward. Kane's face drained. Her mask broke. And for the first time in her long career, she looked small, cornered, human. The trial stretched for days, but the verdict came swiftly. Guilty, every charge. The gavel cracked again, and Kane's shoulders sagged. The senator who once ruled with venom was led away in cuffs, her empire crumbling into dust. The press swarmed outside. Headlines screamed across every screen. Captain Marquez clears her name. Senator Kane FALLS, the nobody who stood. But Elena didn't linger on them. She walked out into the sunlight, Daniel at her side, row a step behind. The cameras shouted questions, demanded emotions, hunted for cracks. But Elena's silence was steady. She didn't need to answer them, because she had already answered in court. Richard tried to claw his way back into the story. He appeared on talk shows, sweating under lights, insisting he was the real victim. She tricked me, she embarrassed me, she was never what she seemed. But the world laughed, not with him, at him. His face became a caricature, his name a cautionary tale. His family cut him off entirely. Alone, bitter, he faded into the background, not a villain, not even a rival, just irrelevant. And Elena never spoke his name again. Vanessa disappeared from her circles, sponsorships canceled, her cruelty recorded forever in viral clips. Margaret Hale was seen rarely, her pearls replaced with silence. The dynasty was gone. But Elena wasn't chasing their downfall. She hadn't spoken for vengeance. She had spoken for truth. And yet, truth wasn't enough to silence the war inside her. At night, she still woke to the sound of gunfire in dreams, still felt the weight of bodies on her back, still heard Richard's sneer echoing against the walls of her mind. Nobody, orphan, unwanted. And Daniel was there, alive, breathing, steady. But 7 years had carved scars between them that love couldn't erase in a day. One evening, weeks later, they stood together on a rooftop, the city lights flickering below like restless stars. The air was cold, sharp. Daniel leaned on the railing, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I thought losing you would kill me," Elena whispered. He looked at her, his face tired, scarred, but his voice gentle. "And I thought leaving you would save you." They were both wrong. The silence stretched, heavy but not cruel. She turned the medal in her hands, its ribbon brushing her fingers. "Do you think we can ever go back?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "We can't go back, but maybe we can go forward, different, changed, still together if you'll let me." Her throat tightened. The wound of years couldn't be closed with a sentence, but survival was never about wounds healing clean. It was about walking with the scars anyway. She didn't take his hand that night, but she didn't walk away either. In the weeks that followed, Congress called her. Speeches were written, invitations sent. She was asked to become the face of reform, the symbol of truth reclaimed. She accepted only some, refused many. She wasn't here to be used. She wasn't here to be worshipped. She was here to live. The world tried to make her larger than life. She refused. She was only human, and that was enough. One afternoon she returned to the church, alone. The doors creaked open, the air still carrying faint traces of wax and lilies. The pews were empty. The aisle was silent. She stood at the altar where Richard had left her, where Cain had sneered, where laughter had once torn her apart. She placed the bouquet she never carried down the aisle, fresh lilies, their stems wrapped in ribbon. Not as a symbol of loss, but as a marker of survival. Her hand brushed the altar, and in the stillness she whispered, "I am not nobody, I never was." The sunlight through the stained glass painted her face again, crimson and gold. And for the first time she smiled. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply stands. It simply breathes. It simply acts. And that was enough.